Good afternoon, and welcome to the National Press Club. My name is Richard Ryan, and I am Senior Washington Correspondent for the Detroit News and President of the National Press Club. I'd like to welcome club members and their guests in the audience today, and those of you who are watching on C-SPAN or listening to this program on National Public Radio. The video archive of today's luncheon is provided by Connect Live and is available through the National Press Club website at npcpress.org. National Press Club luncheons are also carried live by many sites on the World Wide Web. Press Club members may also access transcripts of our luncheons at our website. Non-members may purchase transcripts, audio, and videotapes by calling 1-888-343-1940. Before introducing our head table, I would like to remind our members of upcoming speakers. On Tuesday, April the 3rd, Ted Forstmann, Senior Partner of Forstmann & Little and Chairman and CEO of Parents in Charge, will be our guest. On Tuesday, April the 10th, Joel Klein, former Assistant Attorney General for the Antitrust Division in the U.S. Department of Justice, will speak on competition policy and antitrust enforcement in the global economy. And on Wednesday, April the 11th, His Majesty King Abdullah of the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan will be our guest. If you have any questions for our speaker, please write them on the cards that are provided at your table and pass them up to me. And please make sure that your handwriting is legible enough for me to read them, and I will then ask as many as time permits. I'd now like to introduce our head table guests and ask them to stand briefly when their names are called. Please hold your applause until all head table guests are introduced. From your right and my left, Otto Kreischer of Copley Newspapers, Don Melvin of the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, Martin Schramm, columnist for Scripps Howard News Service, Richard Salmon, Kiplinger News Editors and a former president of the National Press Club, John Diamond, the Chicago Tribune, Colleen Nunn, the wife of our speaker, David Hess, co-chairman of the Speakers Committee and a former National Press Club president, who also organized today's luncheon. Thank you, David. And skipping over our speaker for a moment, Charles B. Curtis, president of the Nuclear Threat Initiative, Ed Walsh of the Washington Post, John Donnelly, Defense Week, and a member of the National Press Club Board of Governors, George Wilson, National Journal, Steve Myers of the New York Times. Thank you. Few people in the world today can talk about national defense and national security issues with more authority and expertise than our guest, former Georgia Democratic Senator Sam Nunn. Now 62, Senator Nunn has spent much of his life studying such issues. As a young lawyer just out of Emory University Law School, the future senator went to work for the House Armed Services Committee. The committee chairman at the time was Nunn's great-uncle, the legendary Carl Vinson, who served in Congress for more than 50 years, many of them heading the House Armed Services Committee. When Senator Nunn was elected to the Senate in 1972, he won appointment to the Senate Armed Services Committee. He took a course in speed reading, and each night lugged home a briefcase full of briefing papers. Because of such diligence and dedication, Sam Nunn quickly established himself as one of the most respected voices on national defense in the Senate and in the nation. When he spoke, people listened. Senator Nunn's determination to know just about everything there was to know about national defense was so intense, his wife once remarked of him, "He doesn't have a lot of idle thoughts." He was one of Georgia's most popular politicians. He won on his first try for the Senate, even though Richard Nixon carried Georgia with 70% of the vote. In 1984, Ronald Reagan carried Georgia with 60%, but Sam Nunn was winning with a whopping 80%. His popularity was national. He was prominently mentioned as a possible 1988 presidential candidate. But he wasn't interested, he said, because he didn't have a burning desire to be president. Besides, he said, he wanted to watch his son Brian, then a high school senior, play on his school's basketball team. And he and his wife Colleen also have a daughter, Michelle. When Senator Nunn retired from the Senate in 1996, he was named by Washingtonian magazine as the senator who would be missed the most. Senator Nunn is now co-chairman and chief executive officer of the Nuclear Threat Initiative, a foundation he launched with media mogul Ted Turner last January, right here at the National Press Club. The organization, funded by $250 million of Mr. Turner's money, is dedicated to reducing the global threat of weapons of mass destruction, nuclear, biological, and chemical. Senator Nunn is neither an alarmist nor a sky is falling chicken little. He is simply realistic enough to know that despite the collapse of the Soviet Union, the world remains balanced on the knife edge of nuclear catastrophe. There also is a great risk of chemical and biological attacks from nations who have not yet developed the capacity to launch nuclear missiles. While still in the Senate, Senator Nunn and Republican Senator Richard Lugar of Indiana passed legislation aimed at gaining greater control over Russia's huge nuclear arsenal. So far, under the act, 5,000 warheads of Russia have been retired. For their work, Senators Nunn and Lugar were nominated last year for the Nobel Peace Prize. When Senator Nunn left the Senate, he became a distinguished professor at the newly renamed Sam Nunn School of International Relations at Georgia Tech University. Senator Nunn had attended the university in the 1950s. I said when I finished at Tech, I'd come back under two conditions. Senator Nunn said at that time, first, they had to get rid of mechanical drawing. And second, they had to get women. They've done both, so here I am. Well, Senator, the press club has no mechanical drawing, and we do have plenty of women. So please join me in welcoming Senator Sam Nunn to the National Press Club.
Thank you very much, President Richard Ryan, and I appreciate that introduction. And I particularly appreciate you adding the word idle in front of Colleen's quote. As the old-timers like David Hess and Pat Towell and George Wilson and John Diamond and Nolan Walters and Marty Schramm and others in the room may recall, my greatest privilege as a United States Senator was to focus on the security interests of our nation and to work closely with our men and women in uniform to strengthen our defenses. Increasingly in my years as chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee, that meant working to respond to the emerging dangers of the post-Cold War world. Today, I'm pleased and honored to have a chance to share my thoughts with members of your press club and your guests as I renew my personal commitment to the cause of threat reduction through our work with the Nuclear Threat Initiative. Supported by the generosity of Ted Turner and guided by a distinguished board that Ted and I co-chair, the Nuclear Threat Initiative is a new foundation dedicated to reducing the global threat from nuclear and also biological and chemical weapons. Our job is to increase public awareness, encourage dialogue, catalog action, and promote new thinking about these dangers both in this country and around the world. The need to think anew is the theme that I would like to spend a few minutes with you today, because we do indeed need to think anew about these challenges. 10 years ago, just after President Gorbachev was released from house arrest following the failed coup, a United States Senator on an official visit to Moscow met with him in his Kremlin office and asked him, as the meeting was closing, directly if he had retained command and control of the Soviet nuclear forces during his arrest. President Gorbachev did not answer, and that was answer enough. I was that senator. The Soviet Empire was coming apart. I was optimistic that this breakup would basically expand freedom, and I was hopeful that it would reduce the risk of war, certainly global war. But I left Moscow in the early fall of 1991 convinced that it would also present a whole new set of dangers. Over the next 2 months, I formed a partnership with Senator Dick Lugar, Senator Pete Domenici, Senator Carl Levin, Senator John Warner, and others to address these new threats to our security. In the 10 years since, much has been done, but the dangers persist and in some cases have increased. Let's take a look today at just a few of the events that we know about that have occurred in the last decade. In 1994 in Prague, authorities confiscated 2.7 kilograms of extremely potent nuclear bomb-making material. In 1995, Russian early warning systems initially misinterpreted a peaceful U.S. research rocket launch from Norway, which activated President Yeltsin's nuclear briefcase and set in motion Russian procedures for a nuclear response. In the spring of 1995, members of the Japanese cult Aum Shinrikyo launched a sarin gas attack on the Tokyo subway. Before their organization was broken up, they were actively recruiting Russian scientists, had literally thousands of members in Russia, and also were working to develop biological weapons and to obtain the Ebola virus. In the spring of 1998, India and Pakistan, two countries that have fought 3 recent wars, exploded nuclear tests within days of each other. Both nations now have nuclear weapons. Neither has sophisticated warning or safety systems, and there is a continuing insurgency along their common border. In 1998, an employee at a Russian nuclear weapons laboratory was arrested trying to sell nuclear weapons designs to agents of Iraq as well as Afghanistan. Throughout the 1990s, thousands of Russian weapons scientists saw their jobs cut or wages slashed, and thousands responsible for the security of nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons and materials literally went months without pay. During this period, Iranian intelligence officers began making recruiting trips to Russia, offering biological weapon scientists many times their pay to move to Iran. In 1999, terrorist Osama bin Laden said, quoting him, "To seek to possess the weapons that could counter those of the infidels is a religious duty," end quote. In our new century, this increased interest in acquiring nuclear weapons is more than matched by increased access to information. Today, anyone with a computer and a modem can find rudimentary instructions for building a nuclear weapon on the internet, and of course millions have access. Now, these are known events. The larger dangers lie in what we don't know. As we enter the second decade of the post-Cold War world, let me repeat a statement today often made, but too often not heard. The most significant, clear, and present danger to the national security of the United States is the threat posed by nuclear as well as other weapons of mass destruction. Nothing else comes close. The public perception of the threat is very low. The reality of the threat is very high. There's a dangerous gap between the threat and our response. And when I say our, I mean the whole world response. To close this gap, we must make a fundamental shift in the way we think about nuclear weapons, the spread of nuclear weapons of mass destruction, and our national security. A story by my humorous friend that many of you know, former Senator Alan Simpson, helps make this point, I think, rather vividly. Alan tells it like this: Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson are on a camping trip. After a good meal and a bottle of wine, they crawled into their tent and they went to sleep. Some hours later, Holmes awoke and nudged his friend. "Watson, look up and tell me what you see." Watson replied, "I see millions and millions of stars." "What does that tell you, Watson?" asked Holmes. Watson pondered a minute and replied, "Astronomically, it tells me that there are millions of galaxies and potentially billions of planets. Astrologically, I observe that Saturn is in Leo. Horologically, I deduce that the time is approximately 3:15. What does it tell you, Holmes?" Holmes was silent for a full minute. Then he spoke. "Watson, you idiot, someone has stolen our tent." Those of us whose thinking was shaped during the Cold War are like Watson, in danger of missing the obvious. We can become so attached to what we know and what we've studied that we miss what's new. As the whole world has changed, threats have changed. When threats change, our strategy and our tactics must change. So I think it is time to think anew. 2 months ago, a new president took office. One of the first rites of initiation for any new president is to receive a briefing on the nuclear war plan. If you will permit me a moment of poetic license, I would like to suggest today what a military briefer could have said in such a briefing to the President. Our primary mission, Mr. President, is to deter a nuclear attack against the United States and our allies. This mission has remained essentially unchanged for the last 50 years. Our deterrent strategy depends on the unquestioned ability of our nuclear weapons to survive a massive Russian nuclear strike and still be able to retaliate with enough force to destroy Russia, literally and absolutely. To support this strategy, the United States maintains more than 2,000 nuclear weapons on high alert and many more on standby, ready to launch within minutes. So does Russia. Once launched, we have no capacity to divert missiles or to destroy them in flight. Neither does Russia. Mr. President, Russia can no longer afford to keep most of its submarines at sea or its land-based missiles mobile and therefore invulnerable. This reduces Russia's confidence that their nuclear weapons can survive a first strike and makes it more likely that Russia will launch its weapons not after an attack actually hits, but after the mere warning of an attack. Russia's early warning systems have eroded dangerously, and this increases the chance that a warning could be false. We worry that Russia's command and control of its nuclear weapons will also erode under severe economic pressures. Now, this briefing is imaginary, and it would not likely have been given to the President in exactly this form. I believe, however, that the facts are accurate. As President Reagan's former Undersecretary of Defense, Fred E. Clay, has recently observed, a man from Mars comparing the United States nuclear posture today with that at the height of the Cold War would find them essentially indistinguishable. Today, our nuclear posture is based on a strategy designed for a far different era, when the Soviet Union threatened a catastrophic nuclear attack, had the conventional forces to overrun Europe, and championed a communist crusade against the freedoms that define our nation. Today, Russia is not promoting a competing economic or political system. It is struggling to make its way in the new global economy. The old threats we faced during the Cold War, a Soviet nuclear strike or an invasion of Europe, were threats made dangerous by Soviet strength. The new threats we face today, eroded early warning, increased reliance on early launch, and increased reliance on tactical or theater nuclear weapons, are threats made dangerous by Russia's weakness. And these threats go far beyond deployed Russian nuclear forces. Much of Russia's nuclear, biological, and chemical weapons and materials are poorly secured. Its weapons scientists and its security personnel and guards are poorly paid. This, too, is a consequence of Russia's economic weakness, and it multiplies the chance that weapons of mass destruction will come into the hands of rogue states or terrorist groups. Not only are the threats today different, the means to meet them are also different. We address the Cold War's threats by confrontation with Moscow, and over the long term, we cannot rule out a possible return to this type confrontation. But most of today's greatest threats we can only address in cooperation with Russia. This is the overarching present-day reality of our relationship and the threats. This is not to say that we must embrace Russia as a friend or an ally. That depends on Russian behavior, and we will certainly continue to have frictions, we'll have continuous frustrations, and certainly disagreements. This is to acknowledge, however, that in spite of and because of its economic weakness, Russia will be a major factor for better or worse across most of the spectrum of actual and potential threats that we face today and in the years ahead. We have a vital national security interest not only in assuring strategic stability between our two countries, we also have a vital national security interest in working with Russia to make sure that weapons of mass destruction do not end up in the hands of those who would not hesitate to use them against America or our allies, or to use them against Russia. Now, to some extent, this is something both countries have recognized. In the past 10 years, we worked with Russia to persuade Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and Belarus to give up their nuclear weapons that they inherited from the Soviet Union. This move eliminated more nuclear weapons than those contained in the entire nuclear arsenals of China, France, and the United Kingdom combined, and kept those newly independent states from adding their fingers to the nuclear trigger. Our cooperative program has destroyed hundreds of missiles and hardened silos, more than 80 bombers, 18 nuclear submarines, and hundreds of submarine missile launchers, and also deactivated, as was said in the introduction, literally thousands of warheads. We've also helped Russia secure their nuclear weapons and materials to prevent theft and accidents. We've helped them convert nuclear weapon facilities to civilian purposes, and we've helped them employ their weapons scientists in peaceful purposes. So we have started, but there is a long, long way to go to accomplish the mission. We've just started to work with Russia to make improvements in joint early warning communications to reduce the chance of catastrophic error. Now, these are important steps, but we need giant strides. I am puzzled by recent rumors which indicate that budgets for these essential threat reduction programs may be seriously reduced. If true, this would be heading backward. No one knows how long the present window of opportunity will remain open. More than 1,000 tons of highly enriched uranium and at least 150 tons of weapons-grade plutonium exist in the Russian weapons complex, enough to build at least 60,000 nuclear weapons, and some estimate 80,000. Many storage sites are poorly secured. Thousands of weapons scientists are still without a steady paycheck, and terrorist groups and rogue states are trying to exploit that situation. As a Department of Energy task force chaired by former Senator Howard Baker and Lloyd Cutler reported in January of this year, this represents America's gravest unmet threat. No investment pays a higher dollar-for-dollar dividend in national security than investment in threat reduction. None. I welcome the President's review of these programs, and I believe they can be better coordinated and they can be made more effective. I am optimistic about this review which has been announced because President Bush expressed support for threat reduction during the campaign. And he showed that he knows that new thinking is required with these words, and I quote from his remarks at the Reagan Library, quote, "Both Russia and the United States face a changed world. Instead of confronting each other, we confront the legacy of a dead ideological rivalry, thousands of nuclear weapons which in the case of Russia may not be secure. And together we also face an emerging threat from rogue nations, nuclear theft, and accidental launch. All this requires nothing short of a new strategic relationship to protect the peace of the world," end quote. I agree, and I trust that the President's final budget and his policies will reflect these words of wisdom. The Bush administration also is undertaking reviews of U.S. nuclear posture, missile defenses, and conventional forces. As they take on this huge challenge, I urge them to be willing to think anew without any undue homage to inherited propositions and presumptions. Our task is formidable and our approach must be comprehensive. We must address the threats of nuclear, biological, and chemical weapons and multiple delivery systems, update our approach to deterrence, get an accounting on the numbers and deployments of tactical nuclear weapons, reduce the risk of an accidental launch, cut the risk of a terrorist attack, counter the threat of a rogue nation attack, and limit the spread of weapons of mass destruction. We cannot and we will not be successful unless we are able to work with nations whose cooperation is essential for to meet these multiple dangers and to provide for effective defenses. Most importantly, we must recognize that our national security is not enhanced by pursuing arms control treaties at all costs, or by seeking deep reductions at all costs, or by deploying national missile defense at all costs. Each approach is a means to advance our safety, but none can make us secure on its own. The threats are interrelated, and our approach must be interrelated. To borrow a sports metaphor, we must defend against the long bomb, but we also have to guard against the end run. Any good coach will consider whether being too focused on stopping one threat could leave the team more vulnerable to another. The value of each component of our defense must be measured not by its ability to counter one threat, but by its role in our overall strategy of defense against the full range of threats. As we struggle to think anew, we must be guided by broader vision. As that famous strategist Yogi Berra observed, you've got to be careful if you don't know where you're going, because you might not get there. In terms of direction, I believe we should seek a world where nations rely on nuclear weapons less, not more. Unfortunately, today, Russia is moving in the opposite direction. So are India and Pakistan, and perhaps China. We should seek a world where the United States and Russia move beyond a doomsday posture and no longer threaten each other with nuclear annihilation or nation-ending damage. Until we do this, the United States and Russia cannot have what anyone would call a normal relationship. We should seek a world where our strategic posture, both offensive and defensive, does not undermine our ability to cooperate with major powers like Russia and like China, and with allies like NATO and Japan, to stop the spread of weapons of mass destruction. We should seek a world where we evaluate our policies, strategies, and programs by their ability to move toward zero the risk that nuclear and other weapons of mass destruction will ever be used anywhere by anyone, whether by design or by accident. Some will say we will never be at zero risk. I agree. But that should not affect our direction, nor should it affect our purpose. I believe that we must move in this direction not at the expense of our security, but on behalf of it. Let me be clear. I'm not talking about the total elimination of all nuclear weapons, a goal that generates much skepticism and much disagreement. I'm talking about risk management and risk reduction, an objective on which there can and should be broad common ground. To move in this direction, however, we have to face some difficult but fundamental questions that have been deferred, from my perspective at least, far too long. Let me conclude my remarks by asking a few of these questions today. If our objective is to move with Russia from a posture of mutual assured destruction toward mutual assured safety, we must ask, has Russia's weakened economic and security condition, combined with continued U.S. capacity for a rapid, massive strike, increased the risk of a Russian accident or mistake with potential catastrophic consequences for us and for them? Do we really have strategic stability today, or are we like the frog who doesn't jump out of the pot because the water comes to a boil slowly? If our objective is to move Russian and U.S. fingers further from the nuclear trigger, we must ask, are there changes the United States and Russia can make in how we operate our forces that would give each president more nuclear decision-making time, expanding minutes to hours, then perhaps hours to days? Can we get our best thinkers, including, of course, our military experts, together to discuss what can be done to ease the trigger pressure on both sides? This discussion could lead to force structure changes. It could lead to deployment changes. It could lead to alert changes or reductions in the number of weapons, or all of these. Difficult? Absolutely. Yes, it will be. But these steps in the long run may be more important in reducing the risk of a nuclear catastrophe than the absolute number of weapons. If our objective is to ensure that nuclear weapons can't be launched by accident, then we must ask, can we strengthen and build on the early warning system cooperation that we have just started with Russia? Can we assure that the United States and Russia can quickly and accurately identify a nuclear attack from a third party so that a rogue state or terrorist group could not trigger a nuclear exchange between the United States and Russia? And while we're trying to prevent accidents, why not look seriously at the possibility of both the United States and Russia installing destruct packages on nuclear missiles so that both of our countries can destroy our own missile launched, if launched by accident, before it can destroy a city or start a war? We have these destruct devices on test missiles with no nuclear warheads. Why not put them on nuclear missiles? Can we find a way to increase our security against a limited ballistic missile attack, a national security goal I've long supported, without undercutting the international cooperation we depend on to defend ourselves against the full range of threats from weapons of mass destruction? This is a key question. If our objective is to ensure that nuclear, biological, and chemical weapons and materials don't fall into the hands of rogue nations and terrorists, we must ask, is this a priority or is it an afterthought? If it's an afterthought, after what? What comes before it? If it's a priority, is this reflected in our effort and our investment? Are our allies in Asia and Europe doing their share? If not, why not? If our objective is to find a speedier alternative to traditional arms control by taking unilateral action, as is being discussed seriously at this time, a few questions along that line. Can we avoid the problems we now have with Russian tactical nuclear weapons, where we don't know how many they have and where they are? Can we avoid abandoning the benefits of arms control, such as transparency and verification? If we take unilateral steps, can we follow with a formal legal agreement that will ensure accountability, predictability, and stability, and help with verification? Can we expand the cooperative threat reduction program, as Senator Lugar has suggested, in order to create incentives for Russia to make reciprocal changes which we can then verify? In conclusion, even in the age of quantum physics, there are some Newtonian principles that are still instructive. A body at rest tends to stay at rest unless acted on by an outside force. This is the law of inertia, and it applies not only to celestial bodies and billiard balls, but also to bureaucracies and nuclear policymakers. They, like all of us, are inclined to continue doing things as they've always done them unless acted on by an outside force. First and foremost, the impetus from change must come from the President of the United States. But to bring about a fundamental and sustainable shift in nuclear weapons and nonproliferation strategy, the force for change must also come from bipartisan leadership in the Congress with the support and the understanding of the American public. That is what it will take for any strategy to survive annual budget reviews, presidential successions, and one Congress after another. Changing our thinking to chart a new course will not be easy. But who said citizenship would be easy? When Albert Einstein was asked why we'd made so many advances in physics and so few advances in politics, he answered, "That's obvious. Politics is more difficult than physics." But politics, even though difficult and frustrating, fuels our democratic process. And that democratic process is the best hope that we have. I'm confident that if we all do more to make sure that the American people and their elected representatives have the facts and recognize the stakes, our nation will think and act anew. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Senator. That was a very inspiring speech. I have, however, a number of questions that people would like to ask you. If you would mind returning to the podium. One questioner would like to know that based upon what you have heard so far from the Bush administration, can you stand up here today and say that you are confident that your proposals, your program with Senator Lugar will survive this new administration?
I'm optimistic. I have no way of knowing what this review will conclude, and as I said in my remarks, I welcome the review because I believe that all programs that are governmental in nature should be reviewed on a periodic basis, and I would like to strengthen these programs and have a better coordination of these programs in every way possible. At the core, I'm optimistic because of not only what President Bush said in the campaign, but because the more you get into this, the more logic dictates that this is the only way we're going to be able to address the threat of weapons of mass destruction proliferation. It's the only way. We cannot do it without Russia's cooperation, and Russia has to have help. Anyone who thinks that the highest Russian priority would be to blend down highly enriched uranium when people are not knowing how they're going to feed themselves, unless we help, unless the international community helps, that will not be their top priority in a period of economic distress. So I'm optimistic in the final analysis because logic dictates that we continue these programs.
What assurances do we have that Russia having received $280 million so far toward a possible $6 billion from the United States for plutonium, will not simply continue to produce plutonium as a business proposition?
We have the Russian words, and we have the ability to cut off the purse string. That's what we have. If they do not comply with what they say on these programs, we basically cut off the money. We don't go around and give them $6 billion. We do things with money as they do them on the ground. That's the way all these programs have worked. And we also have cooperative means of verification. So I think we've had, by and large, very good support from the Russians. After all, it's in their interest also to get these under control. Frankly, the Russians probably face more threats from terrorism than we do. The last thing in the world the Russians really want, when they think about it, is to have these materials of these weapons in the hands of terrorist groups that could end up inflicting catastrophe on their soil.
This questioner notes that there's a move afoot in Congress to cut or eliminate the U.S. money for Russian nuclear scientists. And is this a good idea, and what do you suggest can be done about it?
I think we need to do everything we can to see that the people who know how to make nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons but don't know how they're going to feed their families have something meaningful to do. Believe me, there are plenty of places in the world that would put them on the payroll right now. I do not think that is in our interest. So I've spent last week, earlier this week, at Georgia Tech, where we had a conference with Russian nuclear, chemical, and biological scientists. We spent a lot of time with them. We briefed them on things going on in at Georgia Tech with incubators, and we briefed them at CDC, the Communicable Disease Center, as well as Emory University, on things going on there, and the University of Georgia Export Control Program. So these people are engaged. They really do want to find something to do other than to continue the pursuit of making weapons of mass destruction. I think it's fundamentally in our security interest to help them do so.
This questioner notes that Ted Turner has stated that he would advocate total nuclear disarmament, and to further this goal he has donated money to the organization that you now head. However, this questioner says that he understands your organization is not using the money for this purpose. Is this true?
We spent 6 months on a scoping study so that we could make sure that the priorities that Charlie Curtis and I felt were essential were also those that Ted was willing to fund. And we have a very firm understanding in our original press conference. He made it clear that he has not changed his view about the desirability of total elimination, and we made it clear that that's not the purpose of this organization, and that this organization would be run, and the financial decision would be run by a board. Ted is one member. Frankly, the only other two members he knew on the board before he was agreed to name them were Charlie Curtis and me. The rest of them were strangers, but they included Senator Lugar, Senator Domenici, former Secretary of Defense Bill Perry, Ralph Akias, who was the Swedish ambassador and head of the arms control team for the UN in inspecting Iraq, Andrei Kokoshin, a former Deputy Minister of Defense in Russia, as well as Jessica Matthews and Susan Eisenhower, and General Eugene Habiger, who headed the United States Strategic Command. So those are the decision makers. Ted's going to put the money in. He'll have one voice. He's certainly agreed that we're going to have our priorities. And frankly, I think that all of the steps that I outlined today that are essential for risk reduction, if you're ever going to have any kind of debate 15, 20, 25 years from now about whether elimination is feasible, you could never have that debate without taking these steps. So the road is a common road for those who support risk reduction and those who support elimination for the next 10 to 15 years are foreseeable. I myself am skeptical that we will, as I said, ever get to the point where we have no risk, and I'm certainly skeptical that we'd ever get to the point where we'd have no nuclear weapons. We can't disinvent them. People are always going to have the knowledge, and the materials will be here for thousands of years. So mark me down as a skeptic on that point, but our mission at NTI is to reduce the risk of the use of these weapons or the proliferation of these weapons, and to begin to build the trust and transparency that in the long run is conditions precedent to the implementation of the goals of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. That's our mission.
This question worries that further NATO expansion may provoke Russia to rearm. And so how do you propose to deal with Russian statements of outrage and any suggestions of further NATO expansion?
Well, I'm a skeptic on further NATO expansion. I think we ought to do everything we can to include the parts of the former Soviet Union like the Baltics and other places, into the overall world economic system. I do not see that they're under any military threat. Russia today has a very hard time invading itself, as we've witnessed in Chechnya. What Russia will likely do in response is not large rearmament, but increase use and reliance on the early use of nuclear weapons. That is fundamentally against our security interest and against the interest of the region. We don't want Russia to feel threatened, so they go out and deploy thousands of tactical nuclear weapons as they had before. We had a unilateral type arrangement in early '91, which I applauded at the time, where we reduced our tactical nuclear weapons and they reduced theirs. We didn't have an arms control treaty, though, no means of verification, and now we are legitimately concerned that as the Russians feel that NATO is expanding, as the Russians feel that they themselves have had such a severe erosion in their forces, they're going back to more relying on tactical nuclear weapons. We don't know where they are, and we don't know how many there are. So that's one of the downsides of unilateral moves, and as we take this next approach, as some are talking about, for perhaps unilateral cuts in strategic forces, we need to learn from the history of that experience, and we need to make sure that we, I think, follow any unilateral moves with some types of agreement that provides accountability and transparency, and that means the long, tedious negotiations that we've always had to go through. Frustrating, yes, but there is, in the final analysis, no other way to make sure that we can verify and to make sure that we know what's happening. So tactical nuclear weapons are a threat. NATO expansion aggravates the Russians in no uncertain terms. There's no question about that. It causes them apprehension. And I do not think it's in our security interest to have a paranoid Russia that is in a state of economic deterioration. Some people differ on that, but I really would debate that long and hard, because I really do believe that those countries that want to get in NATO primarily want economic integration to the West, and we ought to give them that. But NATO is a military alliance, and if it's going to provide for our security, it's got to remain a military alliance. It's not a purely political or purely economic move, but when you make a move in a military alliance to expand to the borders of your former adversary, you set in motion certain reactions from them that are not necessarily in the security interest of the world.
As far as you can determine, Senator, can Iraq, Iran, Libya, or other states soon develop the capability of launching nuclear weapons without help from Russia? And secondly, how far removed is North Korea from such a capability?
I fortunately have not had an intelligence briefing on this subject, so I can't reveal any classified information. Unfortunately, I don't know the answer to these questions. You'd have to find someone who's been briefed. I do think, though, that the work Bill Perry did with North Korea is one that this administration ought to build on. I would much prefer to try to prevent a missile from being built with all the means we have, diplomacy and economic, than wait until it's built and spend 8 years trying to be able to shoot it down as it's heading toward the United States. I think it's smarter to try to prevent it from being built, and that's the case with North Korea and probably some of the other countries. I also believe this is an area where we can cooperate with Russia. It's not going to be easy. We need their help. We need their help vis-a-vis North Korea. We need their help vis-a-vis Iraq. We need their help vis-a-vis Iran. We've got to understand, though, this has got to be put in a larger economic umbrella. They're not fighting a philosophical war now. They are playing an economic game. Economic games really are like throwing us in the briar patch, but we don't quite realize that. We've got to play an economic game, and frankly, and I'm not talking about foreign aid here, I'm talking about investment, and I'm talking about programs, for instance, buying their excess nuclear materials and putting it under international control. Would cost several $1 billion. What could be better expenditure than buying excess nuclear material lying all over Russia now, not secured properly, a target for terrorists? How could we spend our defense dollars better than leading the way with international help to buy up that material? That would give a flow of funds to Russia. We could put the whole debate on Iraq and Iran and some of the North Korea vis-a-vis Russia under this overall economic umbrella. In the next 4 to 5 years, I think the Secretary of Treasury in this administration will play just as important a role as the Secretary of State and Secretary of Defense in terms of dealing with Russia.
Aside from nuclear weapons, how difficult do you think it would be for rogue states, such as I mentioned earlier, to use biological or chemical weapons against the United States?
If you ever invite me back to the press club, I'll be prepared in 2 or 3 months to talk about biological weapons. I did not get into that in detail today. We are going to be addressing that subject. In direct answer to the question, I think it'd be much easier. And I think biological weapons may be a greater threat than nuclear weapons. The materials are available. We don't have the opportunity like we do with nuclear materials to try to put some safeguards around them and stop them before they spread, because biological materials are used every day in normal commercial and medical research. So it is going to be a very, very big challenge. This is where you get an intersection of the health field and the national security field. We're proud to have Dr. Peggy Hamburg, who formerly headed up the Department of Public Health in New York City and then was at HHS in charge of infectious diseases. She's coming on board next week, and we're going to be very involved in this overall biological threat. One thing we need is an early warning system, so that if something happens anywhere in the world, we know early that it happened and we are prepared to deal with it. And that means health resources, not necessarily national security resources, but the two merge. Another thing we need is an ethical safeguard kind of standard among biological scientists all over the world. We do that on the nuclear side. The private utilities fund a world organization called WANO that every day and every week they have peer reviews in nuclear utility plants, and they swap notes about safety. We don't do that in the biological field. So the answer to the question is it's a huge challenge, and we're just beginning to think about it, but we are going to be very involved. And I must add, before we get to the last question, that all the things we do in the NTI are going to be transparent and certainly in close coordination with the United States government. We are not going to be going off on something that we do not consult with our government about. We hope to fill the gaps left by government. We are not in any way going to supplant government. The heavy lifting and the big money has to be done by government. We're going to do what we can to help fill the gaps.
Well, we're still a little ways away from the last question. This questioner would like to know, does this country need to be worried about a couple of guys like the Oklahoma City bombers mixing what was described here as a bathtub nuclear bomb or a brew of bubonic plague?
The answer to that question is yes, we do. And this gets to the very point I was making about biological. These materials are there. The same thing could be said with chemicals. We're going to have a much better early warning system. We're going to have much better intelligence. We're going to have a more alert law enforcement. And we're going to help the first responders out there. We passed legislation called Non-Lugar Diminuti in '96. It's being implemented, and it really has the seeds of what I think we've got to really build on, in the sense that we've got to have our policemen and firemen and our health officials working together on a local level, not only to be able to detect it if there's some kind of biological outbreak, but be able to detect in sufficient time to take timely steps. One of the things that came home loud and clear to me during the '96 Olympics in Atlanta, I spent 2 or 3 weeks before the Olympics working with our best federal teams, military and civilians, on the biological and chemical threat during the Olympics. We have to really take a lot of steps to be prepared for that thing on any major event, that kind of thing. And when that bomb went off in the Olympic Park, the people who were all prepared to gear up with chemical and biological gear to protect themselves, and these were only federal people, the state and locals had none of that kind of equipment, they had to make a call. The call is whether there was a biological agent or a chemical agent in that bomb. And they made the right call. They didn't gear up. If they put on that gear, we probably would have had several hundred people injured or even killed in terms of the panic it would have caused. It was not a biological or chemical agent, thank God. But by the time we knew that, we'd already transported people who had been injured all over the city of Atlanta in hospitals where if it had been biological, the disease would have spread everywhere. So we're going to have to be much better prepared to deal with that situation. We've got to have some way of early detection. I know that the research and development is being done on early detection, so we know not only that it's a biological weapon that's been used, but that we know what kind it is, so we know how to take care of it. We have a long way to go with this. This is a domestic problem, but it ties in with this overall effort we call non-lugar, because the best place to stop this is before it ever gets to our shores, and that's what the other program is all about.
Do you think, sir, that the United States military needs to be fundamentally reformed, as some of the things that President Bush has said?
Well, I applaud the review that President Bush is undertaking, because I think you really, as the new administration, need to take a fresh look. I do think there have been considerable changes in the threats. I don't think our strategy has changed anything like the change in the threats. So I think there's room for some comprehensive review and some new directions, particularly as I've addressed today in the nuclear arena, but also, I'm sure, on the conventional side.
Here's a question that always frightens a lot of people. What are the prospects for another round of defense base closings in the next few years?
Well, I haven't been plugged into that process. I know in the last base closing round, when President Clinton was in office, Congress got awfully frustrated the way it was handled. Chuck Robb is here, and he knows that, and he could probably speak to it better than I. So I think it'll be very difficult politically to get another round of base closing through the Congress. I do add, though, that when you look at our infrastructure, our bases, and then you look at the size of our forces, the infrastructure has not come down in proportion to the size of the forces. And we do need more money in long-term research and development and weapon procurement, and that means we have to do some more infrastructure cutting. So I don't think we should consider all the bases in the country sacred, except those in Georgia and Virginia.
Yeah. And maybe New Hampshire. Here's a couple questions about someone who wants to know about weapon systems. And this one asks, do we need to build more submarines, or is it only pork barrel spending for shipyards? And secondly, what weapon systems would you cut? The Joint Strike Fighter, F-22?
I've been out trying to make a living the last 4.5 years, and I'm not really able to give you a good answer on these questions. I have not reviewed the programs. I have not looked at the merits. I have not tried to match up one program versus the other, but it is apparent that that kind of review is going on, and so I'm going to wait like everyone else and see what the Bush administration comes up with.
You talked a little bit about a missile defense system, which is, as you know, a throwback for President Reagan's old Strategic Defense Initiative. Is such a system technologically feasible? Should we go forward with this thing?
Well, President Reagan was talking about a comprehensive defense shield that would basically be able to stop the Russian attack, if there was one, or the Soviet Union attack in those days. What we're talking about now is fundamentally different. It's to stop a limited attack, to stop a missile that's launched by accident. As I said, I think the quicker way to do that one right now would be to put destroy mechanisms on the missile so each of us could destroy our own missile if launched. The other aim of the limited missile defense would be to stop a limited attack, small attack by a third world country like North Korea or Iraq. I think there's a place for that kind of development in our overall plans. I do think, as I mentioned in the speech, that the relationship we have with Russia, the relationship we have with China, the relationship we have with our allies is absolutely essential to be considered as we go forward with this. It cannot be national missile defense at all costs and at all expenses. If we end up not having allies in the world and cooperation with countries like China and Russia, the effort to stop a missile from North Korea, or Iraq, or Iran may end up costing us on the nonproliferation side in terms of serious consequences. So we've got to take that into account. I also would like to see this debate take place on the basis that national missile defense is a technology and not a theology.
Now we've come to the last question. But before doing so, I would like to present you, Senator, with a certificate of appreciation for your appearance here at the National Press Club, as well as a National Press Club mug, usable for many things. And it's good to see that our tent is still here. This questioner would like to know, what do you miss the most and the least about being in the Senate?
Well, dealing with the media is one of those, and I will let you consider it. I do miss my media friends. I was always treated very fairly, and I think our news media does one heck of a job overall, with a few errors and omissions along the way. So I do miss the relationship I had with people in the Senate, old friends in the Senate, my staff people who really were terrific over the years, some of whom are in this room today. Those are the things that you miss. I also miss the big debates. I don't miss the activity that is the subject of the debate now ongoing, which is campaign fundraising. That was never much fun, and whatever you think about the remedies being proposed, this is not my subject today, but the present system is a disaster, and we've got to do something about it. I don't miss that part of it, and I think that does discourage an awful lot of people from getting into the politics, and it particularly is disillusioning to our young people. So I had a very hard time deciding to leave the Senate, as my wife Colleen knows. Very, very tough decision, but I've loved the private sector. And now I've got the best of all worlds. I'm dealing with these large public policy issues, but I'm not in government. That's two good things.
Senator, I'd like to thank you very much for your appearance here today. And I'd like to thank all of you for coming here today. And I'd also like to thank National Press Club staff members Melinda Cook, Pat Nelson, Joanne Booz, Melanie Abdel-Dermot, and Howard Rothman for organizing today's lunch. And also thanks to the NPC Library for the research about Senator Nunn. I appreciate that. Thank you. We're adjourned.